Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal Sasha once believed that leaving Port Charles was the only viable path to protect her daughter, a desperate yet deliberate decision shaped by the whirlwind of chaos and deception that had consumed her life. In her heart, she no longer trusted the city that had once offered her glimpses of hope and healing. Each time she walked down the familiar streets, she felt watched, as though unseen eyes were tracking her every move, whispering sinister messages through silence and shadows. Since Daisy's birth, Sasha had carried a growing dread that someone, or something, was constantly attempting to get closer to her child, not through overt threats, but through small, almost imperceptible manipulations. A misplaced pacifier, a window left cracked open, an unfamiliar blanket that had never belonged to Daisy. These subtle signs did not scream danger to others, but they rang like alarm bells in Sasha's soul. It was not paranoia, she told herself. It was instinct. The same instinct that had saved her in the past, the same instinct now screaming that she and Daisy were no longer safe. The sleepless nights became routine. Sasha would lie awake, listening to the creaks of the house, her body tense, arms curled protectively around Daisy. Michael tried to soothe her worries, attributing them to maternal anxiety, perhaps worsened by trauma. But he didn't feel what she felt. He didn't wake up gasping from nightmares that blurred too easily with reality. Michael had never looked into Daisy's crib only to find her gone, only to blink and see her there again. Whether these moments were tricks of the mind or warnings from the universe, Sasha didn't know. All she knew was that she couldn't afford to ignore them. But in Michael's eyes, Sasha was slipping. The cautious routines, the excessive security, the way she clutched Daisy a little too tightly in public, it all began to paint a picture of a woman teetering on the edge of collapse. Friends and even medical professionals began to murmur concerns behind closed doors. They labeled it maternal delusion, postpartum obsession. They didn't see the bigger picture, or worse, they refused to. Michael, who had once fought for Sasha during her darkest days, now stood on uncertain ground. He had seen her unravel before and feared history might be repeating itself. He began to question where protection ended and delusion began. Still, Sasha didn't wait around for validation. She didn't need another intervention. She needed escape. Silently and carefully, she devised her exit strategy. She told Michael she was looking into quieter neighborhoods, somewhere with less noise and less chaos for Daisy to grow up in. But behind that innocent narrative, Sasha had already arranged a fake identity, secured a vehicle under a friend's name, and planned a departure in the dead of night. She would leave no trail, no goodbye. Only distance. She clung to the belief that somewhere beyond Port Charles, peace awaited her and Daisy. Far from those who doubted her, from the dark cloud that had begun to settle over her soul. But what Sasha could never have anticipated was that the true threat wasn't just some faceless presence lurking in the alleys of Port Charles. The real danger had been watching her all along with a calm, composed smile and eyes that had long since lost their warmth. Willow. Once an ally, once a motherly figure, now transformed into something colder, more calculating. For Willow, Sasha's continued presence wasn't just an emotional wound, it was an existential threat. Sasha reminded her of everything she'd lost, Michael, Wiley, and the carefully constructed identity of the perfect mother she had clung to so desperately. Watching Sasha hold Daisy ignited a fury in Willow that she could no longer suppress. The grief she had tried to bury after losing Wiley resurfaced not as sorrow but as rage. Her envy metastasized into obsession. And in the mirror, where once stood the gentle and forgiving Willow, now stood a twisted reflection of someone else entirely, Nellie. Not in name, but in spirit. Willow began to emulate the same tactics Nellie had once used, deceptive, manipulative, perfectly masked beneath a veil of victimhood. She whispered to Carly about Sasha's instability, dropped hints in conversations that Sasha might pose a danger to Daisy. When she cried in public, she made sure the tears were seen. When she acted distraught, she ensured that concern followed. But beneath the surface, she was plotting. She hired someone to watch Sasha's home, to follow her movements, to confirm the exact moment she would flee. She studied Sasha's behavior with the precision of a hunter preparing for the kill. Willow wasn't merely trying to interfere, she was orchestrating an ambush. In her mind, Sasha was the villain, and she, the righteous mother wronged by fate. The city had taken Wiley from her. Sasha had taken Michael. Now, Daisy would be her redemption. On the night of the escape, Sasha believed she had covered every track. The safe house was ready, the documents secured, the driver parked quietly 3 blocks away. With Daisy bundled in her arms, she stepped into the night with one last look back at the life she was abandoning. Every breath she took was heavy with hope and fear. As she neared the edge of town, she felt the smallest pang of relief begin to take root. But then she heard the footsteps. Soft, deliberate. Too slow to be accidental. Her instincts screamed again, louder than ever. She turned. Willow stood in the shadows, dressed in black, her face barely illuminated under the pale streetlight. Her eyes were glassy but unblinking, and in her hand, she held a paper, the fake documents Sasha had so carefully guarded. How she got them, Sasha didn't know. Willow took a step forward and whispered words only she could hear, "She's not yours." Sasha clutched Daisy tighter. Her body froze, heart pounding like a war drum. The realization hit her like cold steel, Willow had known all along. She had planned this confrontation. She had waited for this moment. Her transformation was complete, she no longer spoke like Willow, no longer carried herself like the woman Sasha once knew. She spoke like Nellie. She looked at Daisy not with the love of a family friend, but with possessive hunger. Sasha backed away slowly, trying to reason, to escape, but sirens wailed in the distance. Blue lights reflected off the glass windows. Someone had tipped off the authorities. And as the police car pulled up, Sasha saw the familiar faces of Child Protective Services stepping out alongside them. It had all been arranged. Willow had painted her as the threat, fabricated a narrative so convincing that it was no longer about truth, it was about belief. And the world believed Willow. As Sasha stood in the rain, surrounded by flashing lights and accusations, she watched Daisy being taken from her arms, safely, gently, but without mercy. She tried to scream, to fight, but her voice drowned beneath the accusations and judgments from those who never tried to understand. And in the distance, Willow watched with a serene expression. To the world, she looked like a grieving mother witnessing justice. But in her eyes, there was no grief, only victory. And perhaps, in some haunting way, she was right. She had won. Not through love, but through precision. Not through redemption, but through transformation. And Sasha, for all her love, her sacrifices, her fight, was left standing alone in the ruins of a city that had once promised sanctuary, but instead delivered betrayal. Sasha only managed to turn her head when a chill crept down her spine, that primal sense of danger igniting every nerve in her body. Something was wrong. Deeply, terrifyingly wrong. But by the time she registered the disturbance in the air, it was already too late. From the shadows, Willow emerged like a phantom summoned by vengeance, her eyes burning with a hatred so potent it pierced through the darkness like fire. Her mouth curled upward, not in a smile, but in something far more disturbing. It was the expression of someone unhinged, detached from reason and fully submerged in obsession. There was a cruel delight dancing on Willow's lips as she screamed Sasha's name with a venomous force that startled even the night itself. But what sent a deeper, more paralyzing fear down Sasha's spine was what came next. Willow didn't just accuse, she laid claim. Her voice cracked with fury as she screamed, "That's my daughter." And in that instant, the world stood still for Sasha. Everything she had feared, every nightmare she had tried to escape, suddenly crystallized into a single horrifying truth: the danger had never been some faceless, looming force. It wasn't the paranoia she had tried to outrun. It wasn't the shadows in her mind. The true monster was real, flesh and blood, standing in front of her, Willow. The woman who once smiled at Daisy as an ant-like figure now stared with a hunger that was primal, twisted, and terrifying. She didn't want to protect Daisy. She wanted to possess her. She had crossed a line, erased her own identity, and become the very creature she once feared, something worse than Nellie, something methodical and convinced of its own righteousness. Panic surged through Sasha like a thunderstorm. Her grip on Daisy tightened instinctively as she turned to flee, but every path she tried to take was already blocked. She realized, with a sinking weight in her stomach, that Willow hadn't come alone. Figures emerged behind her. Neighbors, social workers, maybe even nurses from the hospital. People Sasha had seen before, people who now looked at her not with kindness or concern, but with silent, judgmental apprehension. They were here for her. Willow had brought them. She had told them a story where Sasha was the unstable one, the danger, the mother spiraling out of control. And Sasha, wide-eyed and clutching her child, suddenly fit the narrative far too well. Disheveled, panicked, shaking with fear. She looked exactly like what Willow had described. The most harrowing part was that none of them seemed to see Willow for what she truly was. They didn't notice the twitch in her eye, the way her voice shook not with sadness but with madness. Her accusations poured out like a well-rehearsed monologue, each word polished by obsession. She wailed that Sasha had stolen her baby, that she had manipulated everyone, that she had preyed on Michael and confused the courts, that she wasn't mentally stable and posed a risk to the child's safety. To the others, she looked like a devastated mother at the end of her rope. But to Sasha, she looked like a predator who had finally found the perfect stage on which to perform. Sasha's voice cracked as she tried to speak, to explain, to plead. Her words spilled over each other, desperate and trembling. Please, listen, she's lying. I'm not running away, I'm protecting Daisy. I was never going to hurt her. You have to believe me. But no one moved. No one came to her side. Instead, they watched as if witnessing a woman unravel before their very eyes. Her shaking hands, her ragged breath, her frantic gaze, it all played into the illusion Willow had so carefully constructed. It didn't matter that Sasha had evidence. It didn't matter that her heart was breaking open right there in front of them. They had already chosen a side. In a surreal blur, Sasha felt Daisy slowly being taken from her arms by a uniformed officer, gently, but firmly. Her body screamed in protest, but her voice failed her. She reached out, her fingers stretching toward her daughter, who looked back at her with wide, innocent eyes. It was a look Sasha would never forget. Confused, afraid, reaching silently for the one person she had always known as Mommy. But Sasha was powerless. Her cries echoed into a void where no one truly listened. She fell to her knees, the grief too heavy to bear, and all around her were voices whispering about mental health, court orders, and temporary custody. And Willow, she stood perfectly still, tears slipping down her cheeks like pearls of manufactured sorrow. But behind those tears was the glint of triumph. This wasn't justice. This wasn't a concerned citizen rescuing a child from danger. This was retribution, calculated and cold. In Willow's eyes, she had reclaimed what was rightfully hers, even if she had to rewrite reality to make it so. She had pulled the ultimate sleight of hand, turning herself into the victim and Sasha into the criminal. The mask of grief had served her well, hiding the madness underneath, and now the world saw only what she wanted them to see. Sasha, now handcuffed and surrounded, felt her heart collapsing under the weight of helplessness. Her world was ending in slow motion, not with violence or noise, but with the quiet cruelty of betrayal. She looked around, hoping, praying, that someone, anyone, would see through the charade. But the eyes that met hers were blank, cold, filled with skepticism. And as she was escorted toward the waiting vehicle, Sasha stole one last glance at Willow, who stood holding Daisy's blanket like a trophy. At that moment, Sasha realized that she had not only lost her daughter but lost her voice, her truth, her chance to be heard. The system had devoured her screams, the people she trusted had turned their backs, and the woman who had orchestrated it all now walked away unscathed, clutching stolen motherhood like a sacred relic. And so, as the doors shut behind her and the night swallowed the last traces of her freedom, Sasha knew she had entered a different kind of prison. One not made of bars, but of lies so carefully crafted, no one dared question them. In those frantic, breathless moments of chaos, the blaring sound of approaching sirens pierced the night like a cruel punctuation to Sasha's unraveling world. The flashing blue and red lights cast eerie shadows across the pavement, illuminating the figures that had gathered to witness her public unmaking. The police arrived swiftly, stepping between Sasha and her child with the clinical efficiency of protocol, their faces unreadable, their hands steady. It didn't matter how desperately she clung to Daisy, how fiercely she tried to explain that she was the one in danger, that she was the one protecting, not threatening. The decision had already been made in hushed phone calls and whispered doubts, long before the officers stepped out of their vehicle. She was given no chance to plead, no time to prove herself. With quiet authority, one of the officers gently but firmly pried Daisy from her arms while another read Sasha her rights. The air around her grew thick with murmurs, concerned bystanders, confused voices, familiar faces now clouded with doubt. "Isn't that Sasha Gilmore?" someone whispered. "Didn't she lose custody before?" another muttered. These weren't questions of empathy. They were daggers made of disbelief, cutting deep into her already shattered heart. As the cold metal of the handcuffs clicked around her wrists, Sasha felt her breath catch in her throat. It wasn't the physical restraint that broke her, it was the symbolism. To be restrained, labeled, processed as a threat, while the true madness went unchecked. Daisy, her daughter, her everything, was now in the hands of Child Protective Services, being whisked away to an undisclosed location. Sasha's cries didn't reach her. Her arms, once the safest place in the world for that little girl, now hung uselessly at her sides. And standing just a few feet away was Willow, composed, eerily calm, her eyes dry, her lips trembling with the effort of appearing as the concerned bystander, grief-stricken, wounded, maternal. She looked every bit the victim. She wore vulnerability like a shield, the subtle quiver in her voice when she answered the authorities, the way her fingers shook ever so slightly as she reached out to touch Daisy's blanket in a gesture of heartbreak. But her eyes, those eyes, betrayed none of it. They were vacant, focused, triumphant. Not a flicker of doubt, not a glimmer of remorse. She had done what she came to do. She had removed Sasha from the equation. And in the stillness that followed the whirlwind, Sasha turned her head one last time as she was led away. That final glance wasn't filled with rage. It wasn't the glare of someone seeking vengeance. It was the hollow, aching look of a woman who had nothing left to lose. Her gaze locked onto Willow, not to accuse her, but to see her, really see her. And what she saw wasn't the woman she once knew. It wasn't the gentle soul who had once comforted her, or the grieving mother she once empathized with. It was a ghost. A specter forged from trauma and twisted righteousness. A being that had wrapped itself in a cloak of justice, but underneath pulsed a heart consumed by hatred and obsession. Sasha didn't hate her. There was no space left in her for that. Only sorrow. Deep, infinite sorrow for the woman Willow used to be, and the monster she had become. Around them, the world spun on with its familiar rhythm. Port Charles remained abuzz with its usual undercurrent of secrets, conspiracies, and political maneuverings. The headlines focused on turf wars, attempted murders, and backroom betrayals. People whispered about Sidwell's schemes and Sonny's retaliation. Curtis and Drew circled each other in a dance of power. Ava played her part in the games of seduction and manipulation. Jason stayed in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. And yet, amid all that fire and fury, a quieter tragedy unfolded unnoticed. It wasn't splashed across the front pages. It didn't involve gunshots or power grabs. But it was a devastation of equal, if not greater, magnitude. A mother lost her child not to death, but to deceit. A woman was stripped of her identity, not by violence, but by narrative. And a third, Willow, stood between them, not as savior, but as a distorted echo of justice gone wrong. Her heart no longer beat for love or healing, but for revenge masquerading as righteousness. She believed herself the guardian of moral order, the avenger of maternal loss. But in truth, she had become the embodiment of delusion. She had let her grief fester into something sharp and toxic, and then she had turned it outward, toward Sasha, toward anyone who reminded her of what she couldn't reclaim. What unfolded that night wasn't just a custody intervention. It was a reckoning. A betrayal of motherhood, a corruption of compassion. And perhaps the greatest tragedy was not Sasha's arrest or Daisy's removal, but the fact that no one saw it. No one questioned the narrative because it was cleaner to believe the woman screaming in the street was unwell, and the one crying softly beside her was the victim. They didn't want to confront the complexity of it all. They didn't want to ask who had truly lost their grip on reality. Sasha had fallen into a trap, yes. But not one made of lies alone. It was a trap of perception, where image outweighed truth, and control wore the mask of love. Her fall was brutal, and it would be remembered by few. But those who knew her, who saw the flicker of devastation in her eyes as the door closed behind her, would never forget. Because in that flicker was a warning, that justice is not always just, that love is not always pure, and that sometimes the villains are the ones who cry the loudest. And in the haunting quiet that followed, as Daisy's cries faded into the night and the onlookers slowly dispersed, Willow stood beneath the street lamp, her face washed in artificial light. She looked like a mother mourning. But in truth, she was something else entirely, something far more dangerous.